Imagine being strapped to a wooden table while a master torturer calmly explains that the device you're about to experience has been specifically engineered to stretch your body beyond its natural limits, and that he has spent years perfecting his technique to ensure you remain conscious throughout every moment of your gradual dismantlement. He tells you that some people have survived this ordeal, but warns that survival often means living the rest of your life as a grotesquely elongated figure, permanently disabled and serving as a walking reminder of what happens to those who defy authority. What makes this scenario even more terrifying is that the torturer isn't lying. Historical records show that some victims did indeed survive the rack, but their accounts of the experience reveal that survival was often worse than death, condemning them to decades of constant pain, physical deformity, and psychological trauma that made every day a struggle just to exist. The rack represented medieval torture's most scientifically precise approach to human destruction, designed by people who had studied anatomy extensively and understood exactly how much damage the human body could sustain while remaining alive and conscious. Unlike crude torture methods that killed quickly through blood loss or organ damage, the rack was engineered to attack the skeletal and muscular systems in ways that would cause maximum pain while avoiding fatal injuries to vital organs. The device operated on the principle of gradual tension, slowly stretching the victim's body until joints separated, muscles tore, and bones cracked, but doing so at a pace that allowed the torturer to stop just short of causing immediate death. Master rack operators were highly skilled professionals who could calculate precisely how much tension to apply to achieve specific results, from minor joint dislocation to complete skeletal separation. The few documented accounts of rack survivors provide horrifying insights into what the human body could endure when subjected to systematic stretching by experts who understood the precise limits of human anatomy. Guy Fawkes, the famous gunpowder plot conspirator, was subjected to extensive rack torture, but survived the initial sessions, though historical records suggest his signature became increasingly illegible as his shoulder joints were gradually dislocated and his hand coordination was destroyed. Anne Askew, a Protestant reformer tortured during the reign of Henry VIII, survived multiple rack sessions but was left so physically damaged that she had to be carried to her execution in a chair, unable to walk or stand due to the complete destruction of her leg and hip joints. These survivors weren't lucky. They were living examples of torture's effectiveness, their broken bodies serving as warnings to anyone who might consider challenging authority. The psychological effects of surviving the rack were often more devastating than the physical damage, as victims were left with not only permanent disabilities, but also severe mental trauma that could make normal human relationships impossible. Survivors reported persistent nightmares about being stretched, panic attacks triggered by any sensation of physical restraint, and complete inability to trust other human beings after experiencing such systematic cruelty at the hands of their fellow creatures. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but in an era that had no understanding of psychological treatment, these mental wounds never healed. The constant pain from their physical injuries was compounded by psychological agony that made every day a struggle against despair and madness. The medical knowledge that informed rack operation reveals how healing professions had been corrupted by institutional demands to participate in systematic torture, with physicians using their understanding of anatomy not to heal but to cause precisely calibrated damage. Doctors were often present during rack sessions to monitor the victim's vital signs and ensure that the stretching process didn't accidentally cause fatal injuries that would end the torture prematurely. They understood which joints could be dislocated without causing immediate death, how much muscle tissue could be torn before vital functions were compromised, and which stretching techniques would cause maximum pain while maintaining consciousness. This represented a complete perversion of medical ethics that turned healers into instruments of institutional cruelty. The mechanical sophistication of different rack designs demonstrates how engineering expertise was systematically applied to the problem of human destruction, with various models being developed for different types of victims and desired outcomes. The Tower of London's rack was considered the most advanced design, featuring precisely calibrated gear systems that allowed operators to apply tension in tiny increments, measuring the exact amount of stretching being applied to the victim's body. Spanish racks incorporated heating elements that would warm the metal components, causing additional pain through thermal expansion of the restraints. Some versions included spikes or cutting edges that would lacerate the victim's skin as they were stretched, adding bleeding and infection to their other injuries. The training and apprenticeship systems that created master rack operators reveal how torture had become a legitimate profession with its own professional standards, educational requirements, and career advancement opportunities. Young men would spend years learning the anatomical knowledge necessary to operate the rack effectively, studying human physiology, joint construction, and muscular systems with the same dedication that medical students might bring to healing arts. They learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when a victim was approaching their physical limits, how to adjust tension to maximize pain while avoiding death, and which psychological techniques would enhance the torture's effectiveness. The most skilled operators commanded high salaries and were sought after by courts throughout Europe. The economic aspects of rack torture reveal how the systematic destruction of human beings had become a profitable enterprise that supported entire industries and professional communities. The construction and maintenance of rack devices required skilled craftsmen, specialized materials, and ongoing technical support that represented significant financial investments. Professional torturers earned substantial incomes from their expertise, while the confiscation of property from convicted victims provided additional revenue streams for the institutions that employed torture. The cost of maintaining torture facilities, including the salaries of operators, guards, physicians, and support staff, represented major budget items for medieval and early modern governments. The legal frameworks that governed rack use demonstrate how sophisticated jurisprudence could be corrupted to serve institutional cruelty rather than justice, with detailed regulations specifying exactly how and when the device could be employed. Courts developed elaborate procedures for authorizing rack torture, including requirements for multiple judicial approvals, physician oversight, and detailed documentation of the process and outcomes. These legal safeguards weren't designed to protect victims, but to ensure that torture was applied systematically and professionally, according to precise legal standards that would make the extracted confessions admissible in court. The bureaucratization of torture made it appear legitimate and rational rather than recognizing it as systematic brutality. The religious justifications for rack torture were extraordinarily sophisticated, drawing on complex theological arguments about the relationship between physical suffering and spiritual purification that convinced many victims that their torture was actually beneficial to their eternal souls. Church authorities taught that the pain inflicted by the rack could serve as a form of purgatory that would cleanse the victim of sin, while providing opportunities for confession and repentance that might otherwise be denied. Some victims were encouraged to view their suffering as participation in Christ's passion, with their physical agony being portrayed as a spiritual privilege that would earn them divine favor. This religious framework allowed torturers to view their work as acts of mercy and spiritual service, rather than criminal brutality. The international variations in rack design and operation reveal how different cultures adapted the basic concept to fit their particular legal systems, religious beliefs, and technological capabilities. French racks were designed for maximum psychological impact, with elaborate theatrical elements that would terrorize spectators while extracting confessions from victims. German versions emphasized mechanical precision, incorporating advanced gear systems and measurement devices that allowed operators to document exactly how much damage they were inflicting. English racks were built for durability and repeated use, with reinforced construction that could withstand years of operation while maintaining their effectiveness. Italian designs often included artistic elements that made the torture devices objects of aesthetic appreciation as well as instruments of pain. The propaganda value of rack torture extended far beyond its effectiveness as a tool for extracting confessions, serving as a form of psychological warfare that could control entire populations through the demonstration of state power and the consequences of resistance. Public rack sessions were carefully orchestrated theatrical events designed to maximize their impact on spectators, with victims being selected not just for their crimes, but for their symbolic value as representatives of broader categories of potential dissidents. The sight of respected individuals being systematically destroyed on the rack sent powerful messages about the futility of challenging authority, while the visible aftermath of torture, the permanently disabled survivors, served as ongoing reminders of the consequences of resistance. The technological evolution of the rack throughout its period of use demonstrates how torture techniques were continuously refined and improved based on empirical observation of their effectiveness and efficiency. Early racks were relatively crude devices that often killed their victims accidentally through excessive tension or mechanical failure. Later versions incorporated sophisticated feedback mechanisms that allowed operators to fine-tune their application of force, while improved materials and construction techniques made the devices more reliable and effective. The most advanced racks included measurement systems that could quantify the amount of stretching being applied, allowing torturers to operate with scientific precision rather than relying on guesswork or intuition. The documentation and record-keeping systems that tracked rack victims provide disturbing insights into how institutional torture was managed as a form of administrative process, with detailed files being maintained on every individual subjected to the device. These records included information about the victim's physical condition before and after torture, the specific techniques employed, the duration of the sessions, and the ultimate outcomes in terms of confessions extracted and physical damage inflicted. The bureaucratic approach to torture made it possible for institutions to analyze and improve their techniques over time, treating human suffering as a management problem that could be optimized through careful study and systematic improvement. The social stigma attached to rack survivors reveals how torture victims were often blamed for their own suffering, with communities treating them as symbols of shame rather than objects of sympathy or medical care. Survivors were frequently unable to find employment, marry, or participate normally in social activities due to their physical disabilities and the assumption that they must have committed serious crimes to justify such extreme punishment. The visible evidence of their torture, elongated limbs, dislocated joints, and permanent physical deformities, marked them as outcasts who served as constant reminders of the consequences of challenging authority. Many survivors became beggars or social outcasts, living in poverty and isolation for the remainder of their lives. The few detailed first-person accounts of surviving the rack provide heartbreaking evidence of the long-term physical and psychological effects of systematic torture on human beings. Survivors described chronic pain that never diminished, joints that remained permanently damaged and unstable, and muscles that had been so severely stretched that normal movement was impossible. They reported constant fear of physical contact, inability to sleep due to pain and nightmares, and complete loss of faith in human goodness after experiencing such systematic cruelty. Many survivors expressed the wish that they had died during their torture rather than living with the ongoing consequences of their ordeal. The medical treatment available to rack survivors was extremely limited, as medieval and early modern medicine had little understanding of how to treat the complex injuries caused by systematic stretching and joint dislocation. Physicians could sometimes reset dislocated joints if the damage wasn't too severe, but the muscle tears, ligament damage, and spinal compression caused by the rack were often permanent and untreatable. Pain management consisted primarily of alcohol and herbal remedies that provided little relief from the constant agony that many survivors experienced. The lack of effective medical treatment meant that surviving the rack often condemned victims to decades of unrelieved suffering that gradually destroyed their will to live. The rare cases where rack victims recovered enough to resume normal lives provide insights into the extraordinary resilience of human beings when faced with systematic attempts to destroy their bodies and spirits. These exceptional survivors often possessed unusual physical strength, psychological fortitude, or social support systems that helped them cope with their injuries and trauma. Some were able to develop coping strategies that allowed them to manage their pain and disabilities, while others found meaning in their suffering by becoming advocates for legal reform or religious conversion. However, even the most successful survivors bore permanent physical and psychological scars that affected every aspect of their lives for decades after their torture. The eventual decline of rack torture came not through humanitarian reform, but through practical recognition that the device was economically inefficient and legally problematic compared to other methods of extracting confessions and controlling populations. The enormous resources required to construct, maintain, and operate racks made them expensive tools for routine law enforcement, while the permanent disabilities they caused in survivors created ongoing social and economic burdens for communities. The development of more sophisticated investigative techniques and legal procedures reduced the perceived necessity for torture-based confessions, while changing political structures made spectacular demonstrations of state power less important for maintaining social control. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how the history of the rack reveals the extraordinary human capacity for systematically torturing fellow human beings while maintaining personal and institutional claims to moral legitimacy and professional competence. The rack operators, physicians, judges, and other officials who participated in this systematic brutality weren't necessarily sadistic psychopaths, but often ordinary people who had been trained to view extreme cruelty as necessary and even virtuous service to legitimate authority. This demonstrates how institutional structures and ideological frameworks can enable ordinary individuals to participate in systematic torture while preserving their sense of moral righteousness and social responsibility. What do you think about this absolutely horrifying demonstration of how supposed medical and legal professionals could systematically participate in torturing people while convincing themselves they were serving justice and social order? Can you imagine the psychological horror of surviving such systematic physical destruction only to discover that the rest of your life would be dominated by constant pain, permanent disability, and social ostracism? The fact that entire professional communities developed around perfecting human torture really makes you wonder about the capacity for institutional evil that exists within supposedly civilized societies, doesn't it? Share your thoughts in the comments about how contemporary institutions might be engaging in practices that cause systematic harm while maintaining claims to professional legitimacy and moral authority. If you found this investigation into the horrific reality of surviving medieval torture as disturbing and thought-provoking as I did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking revelations about how historical practices of systematic cruelty continue to influence our understanding of human nature and institutional power. Ring that notification bell because our next deep dive will explore another example of how professional expertise can be corrupted to serve systematic brutality rather than human welfare. Trust me, these stories will change how you think about the relationship between professional authority and moral responsibility forever.